Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is 18th of March, and today we're covering the situation on the Avdiivka and Hulapli fronts. But before that, as you may know, Putin won the 2024 presidential elections in Russia with a reported 88.48% of the vote, and the voter turnout rate was at 77.44%, which is interesting because it is a 6.7% increase from the voter turnout rate in the 2018 Russian elections, and so there was an increase in the political participation. Now, despite the elections ending on the 17th of March, there are still border clashes, around Belgorod and Kursk oblasts between the Russian side and the GR affiliated anti-Putin groups. And so the most interesting event that occurred, or that we got footage for from the 17th of March, was the entrance of the Siberian Battalion and Chechen groups that are also affiliated with the GUR. So that includes this unit that I've marked over here on the map. It's called the Separate Ichkerian Special Purpose Battalion. There are two other Chechen units, but I do not believe they are on the border with Russia at the moment. This one was. And so this smaller formation, you could say a couple dozen of these troops, they crossed over the border. If we measure it, it's about 1.7 kilometers away from the border, and they were able to enter into the village of Gorkovsky. They took photos, raised their flags within the secondary school and in some of the other local buildings, and that footage came out on the 17th of March. Now, in the time since then, now it's the 18th of March, information came out from Russian sources claiming that operation was something that occurred on the 14th of March, so that would be 4 days ago now, and that was also really the climax of a lot of Ukraine's operations on the border with Russia, as it was just before the election. And they claim that in the time since then, the Russian forces have reestablished control over the village. And there's also been some photos released by the Russian side showing the aftermath of the Ukrainian presence over here. So there's photos on the ground of just some of the destruction to the secondary school and to the nearby regions. So that would be a confirmation that the Russians are back in control of the village. But either way, the Ukrainians were able to get a photo in that section of the front line. Besides that, there really isn't that much information about changes. For now, there is a bit of a status quo where you have drone strikes by the Ukrainian side. You have this cross-border shelling. Something very interesting that actually happened on the 14th of March that we got footage for on the 17th was a Ukrainian Mi-24 attack helicopter being shot down by the Verba Manpad system, which was a part of the air defense array of the 138th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian Federation. So that unit, if you recall, it's a unit that was also stationed around the Kupiansk front, and it appears that at least some of their elements may have also been moved to the border to deal with the situation around Belgorod, and so they responded to that threat from the attack helicopters. And so the Ukrainians, during their raids that really reached their zenith on the 14th of March around the village of Kozinka, they did utilize attack helicopters to provide fire support. They launched unguided rockets towards the village. And so at least in one of those incidents, there was a helicopter shot down, and that really occurred within Ukrainian territory in the village of Lukashivka. We also received today confirmation of another Ukrainian, more rare specialized piece of equipment being destroyed. This time it was the BAT-2, which is an engineering tank. And this is accompanied by at least 4 IMR-2s and 1 VT-72 being destroyed throughout the course of these incursions into Russian-controlled territory. And so it is really interesting to see this amount of specialized equipment being utilized on the section of the front. Part of it is likely due to the Ukrainians wanting to provide support for other vehicles, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles as they were crossing over the border. Some of it is simply because the GUR does have access to a lot of these elements and were just using what they had at their disposal. Some of it may also be to overcome some of the fortifications that the Russians built on the border with Ukraine throughout the past year now. But for the time being, a lot of that is in the past, as on the 18th of March, we've seen a decrease in the fighting. There are still clashes, of course, around Kozinka, but we do have confirmation of Russian full control over that village based on a recent Ukrainian video which shows an FPV strike onto 2 Russian soldiers in a house that is very close to the border. And then besides that, there were some smaller clashes occurring around the village of Tetkino, both sides targeting each other's warehouses and equipment. Here you have a targeting of a Russian warehouse in the center from the Freedom of Russia Legion. And then on the other side, of course, you have Russian FPV strikes into the staging points of the Ukrainians in Avdiivka. Now, moving on to the village of Tabaivka on the Kupiansk front, there is a slight Russian advance that was verified based on two geolocated videos recently released. First one is from the Da Vinci Wolves Battalion of the 67th Mechanized Brigade, which is a unit that has its forces split up. Some of them are fighting further south around Crimea, and then some were probably moved in over the past 2 months to deal with the Russian attempted attacks towards the village of Tabaivka and nearby fields, which led to the salient that we see on the map over here. This salient, which is really sticking out from the rail line, which was the previous line of contact. And so that was a Russian advance that occurred around the end of January. And so the Ukrainians did move in some of the nearby battalions to stabilize the front line. And so in this video that was released by the units, they show some very small elements of the Russian side operating within Tabaivka. You could say it's like individual soldiers or two at most in each strike, and they're operating within houses sometimes, but mainly within shelters and dugouts within some of the northernmost sections around certain tree lines sometimes. And so that gives us an idea of where the Russians are putting their forward positions, where they're trying to hold on and prevent any sort of Ukrainian attack. And those areas are definitely being targeted by Ukrainian drones. There is some Ukrainian drone coverage over here, also verified by a second video, which shows an FPV strike on a Russian soldier within a trench that is running along the highway that then connects to Kupiansk. And there's a trench that was built running parallel to it. And so based on all this, we know that the Russian forces have more control within Tabaivka than we previously imagined. And that is pretty interesting because despite Tabaivka being in a very bad situation in terms of its geography, because it is located on a valley, it has rugged terrain, and it is overlooked from the west by the Ukrainian side, the Russian forces have still managed to hold on to much of their possessions within that village. Now moving on to the Avdiivka sector, we'll look at the northern flank first. To the northwest of Krasnohorivka, the Ukrainians made a slight gain, and this was verified based on geolocated footage showing the Russians, specifically the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade, using its TOS-1A systems to shell Ukrainian fortifications. So you did have a pretty large number of Ukrainian infantry operating in this particular trench that runs parallel to the rail line and to the tree lines. And this was previously under Russian control, but it appears the Ukrainians, over the past couple of weeks, did conduct successful counterattacks. And the reason why they would do this is in order to protect the southern flank of Chervone. Chervone is very important to Ukraine's broader defensive plans for the Avdiivka sector because it is located on the dominant heights in this entire region. Chervone is also a key command center, logistical hub, and so the Ukrainians don't want to give the Russians an attack vector from the south that they can use to organize their forces and then attack further to the northwest and then actually reach it or at least take over positions in fields that are on equal elevation to the ones on which Chervone is located on. Now moving on to Berdichi, there's not much that's changed over here since my last video. Not even Russian sources mention a change in the lines, although they mention it about two other villages further south. What we see is that the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade, despite being stationed on the Avdiivka front since November, of course with varying levels of intensity because they were fighting on the northern flank for much of that. And if you recall, during the sort of climax of the Battle of Avdiivka, the 47th wasn't that involved in the really the most casualty-stricken parts of the front line. They did have some reinforcements sent into those critical parts of the front line at the end, but that was around the southern flank. In any case, they were able to preserve some manpower as a result, and so they still do exhibit a pretty strong defensive capacity, as can be shown by some of the footage they released. So there was one video over here, which is on the outskirts of Stepove, on a dirt road leading into Berdichi that the Russians have really utilized a lot to gain footholds in southwestern or southeastern Berdichi. And so in this one, it's a strike by them, by the 47th Mechanized, on 3 Russian soldiers that were walking along that path. In another one, they show a larger Russian attack that was organized with several BMPs, tanks, and MTLBs. Generally, the point is to break past certain areas that could be considered a gray zone, reach those areas that are critical to securing the front line, dropping off an infantry squad, something of the sorts, and then those infantry are supposed to secure a tree line or a house, and then they are of course supported by the guns of the tank or of the MTLB, depending on the situation. And so in this case, you saw an attempt by the Russian forces to advance through these open fields over here, or through the open or through the dirt road that runs through the southern part of the village. And at that point, they encountered some very fierce resistance from the 47th using FPV drones, and of course using artillery. They're mainly using the cluster munition artillery to target the BMPs directly. Like there was one direct hit that I saw in that video on the BMP. And of course, there were several other vehicles that were damaged, and eventually that attack was repelled. And really, the result of that is that the Russians were unable to breach the Ukrainian forward line that is right now centered around this second road that runs through the central part of Berdichi. And so currently, the Ukrainians still maintain their forward positions around here. And there is a bit of ambiguity as to whether the Russian forces were pushed back from this western section of Berdichi past the Durna River. But we know for sure that the 47th Mechanized Brigade is holding strong in this region. And as I've mentioned, the reason why is because they would rather have their defensive positions built up in houses or in basements or shelters nearby that are more well fortified and less exposed than the ones further to the west along these tree lines or in open fields that really were not prepared for any sort of defensive works up until very recently. And again, they are an open field, so they are easily exposed to the vast Russian superiority when it comes to firepower and especially in artillery. But also, we're looking at the Air Force. Something very interesting that was reported today, I believe by the Deputy Lieutenant General, or actually the Deputy Minister of Defense in Ukraine. He said that since the beginning of 2024, 3,500 bombs have been dropped on Ukraine. He didn't specify that they were all glide bombs, but the implication is that most of them were. And so that's just an insane amount when you think about it. If I were to do the math, it's been like 70 days into 2024, so that's 50 of those being dropped a day, and on certain days more, especially at the climax of the Battle of Avdiivka. But again, that sustained amount of firepower, especially in concentrated parts of the front line, like around the Avdiivka sector, against what you could say are infantry squads in exposed areas, it does lead to high casualties when defending an area like Zaporizhia. And same thing when it comes to Orlivka, where we also saw the Russian forces advance. It was reported by Deep State, actually on the 17th, that they were able to gain control over most of the village. And we saw the gains marked on the Deep State map, looking something like this, where the Russian forces were able to secure additional sections of the gray zone and the roads in the northwesternmost sections of Orlivka, but there is a bit of gray zone left in some of these outskirts. And so it's being reported by a lot of Russian sources is that all of the Ukrainian infantry squads that were on the eastern bank of the Durna River withdrew. They withdrew westwards and left Orlivka. I can't verify that yet, but definitely the Russian forces have now shifted gears and are now focusing on clearing out Orlivka as well. So that's underway. At the same time, Tonenka is also being cleared out. There is a lot of reporting on that from the Russian side, but there is still no confirmation that the northwestern sections of Tonenka have been fully secured. At the same time, the Ukrainian withdrawing forces, they are beginning to set up positions in the fields that are to the east of Umanska, for instance, and a lot of these tree lines or along the river belts. You also have a lot of consolidating of Ukrainian lines, coalescing forces around Semenivka itself, with the Ukrainians trying to protract the fighting elsewhere, like in a place such as Berdichi, in order to give them more time to prepare for the eventual fighting that will reach Semenivka. Now, moving on to Avdiivka, the Russians have continued their assaults, including with armor, but there are no tangible changes to the front line. What I do have, though, is a video that was released from the 46th Air Assault Brigade, one of the main units holding on to this part of the sector. And what they show is a combination of FPVs and ATGMs hitting Russian vehicles that had not even reached Chervone or the line of contact. They were still in Maryinka or in nearby fields, and they were trying to approach the line of contact in order to create breaches and trying to shift the front line several hundred meters to the west or to the north. in an effort to gradually chip away at Ukraine's control of areas such as these fields that are overlooking Chervone. So this is a very important area for the Russians that they would like to secure. Not because it is on an insanely high level of elevation, but it is a good staging point with a small local hill that overlooks some of the Ukrainian positions, for instance, in the Chervone Valley. And so, over the course of several weeks, we have seen attempts by the Russian forces to send in several tanks or MTLBs to push forward, and they have been successful in doing that, especially in the areas that are directly next to the city, or you could say the village of Chervone itself. So you could see that there was a 2 kilometer advance westwards through these fields in recent weeks. But in the fields to the north of that, there still hasn't been a full Russian domination over those positions, and so a lot of them are left in the gray zone. What we saw in the most recent assault released by the Ukrainian side is that they were able to target 5 vehicles as they were making their way from the Donetsk sector into Maryinka and then from there towards the line of contact. Before they were even able to do that, they were targeted by the FPV drones, and it led to the destruction of a Russian T-80. It led to the destruction of a BMP-1 and 2 BMP-2s, as well as another tank being abandoned before they could really push forward. But an area where we did recently see a slight Russian advance was on the Huliapoli sector. So this is an area of the front line that I've not talked about, and my map is not fully in sync with the realities on the ground. So Huliapoli, again, even during the summer counteroffensive, the Ukrainians didn't pour much resources into pushing in this direction, and really the Russians never did, even when they had the initiative on other parts of the front line. This area of the front line, you could say, has less mines. It's less dense in terms of fortifications. On the Ukrainian side, you could say, for instance, and generally there have been less resources directed to the sector, including in terms of manpower. So the types of units that the Ukrainians have over here are some of the weaker, poorly trained ones, you could say, like the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade, which is generally supposed to hold onto the sector and engages in positional fighting. At the same time, the Russian forces, they recently moved in elements of the 114th Motorized Rifle Regiment, a DPR unit that was previously fighting around the Avdiivka sector. It appears that maybe some of those elements were moved in following the end of the battle there. And so this is a way of, sending some of those units that are not needed on the Avdiivka sector to engage in other activities on other parts of the front line. And so they released footage about a month ago showing some pretty significant shelling, including with the TOS-1A systems, of various Ukrainian fortifications that were built in between the villages of Chervone and Maryinka. So that includes in a lot of these tree lines over here, and also within those villages themselves, like Maryinka, I believe, was one of the villages shown in that shelling compilation. And so there has been some significant Russian artillery preparation over the course of the past month. There has been an uptick in shelling on those Ukrainian forward lines that are right now mainly being held by the 79th Battalion of that unit. And then a couple of days ago, we started seeing the first Russian attempts at, gauging the Ukrainian strength in their defense. And so there were some vehicles sent towards the line of contact, not anything too significant, but they were moved in from their positions around like Marfapil or Chikalova, and the Russian forces were able to advance about 2 kilometers, and this is now the new line of contact, which runs along this local stream just to the south of Chervone, and you could see how the line has coalesced around that sector. So during that Russian assault, which occurred on the 15th, you had a Russian T-80 being destroyed along with 2 BTR-82s, and then another video, a tank was damaged by the 102nd Brigade's FPVs. And so despite, not being a critical part of the front line, the 102nd does still have those drone capabilities, and that played a role in stopping the small Russian attack. And so it'll be interesting if the Russian forces continue to uptake pressure over here, just because more generally there are less resources dedicated over here, and there aren't many reinforcements or reserves to be moved around in a very quick manner to hold the line in an area like this. It certainly is possible though, but it would mean weakening other sectors where the Ukrainians are also currently defending. In any case, what you see is that Huliapoli is in a very interesting geographical situation because it is located on a valley. More generally, the entire string of towns that is attached to Huliapoli is also in the valley, which would include the Russian-controlled villages. But then the fields to the west and to the east of it are located on ridges overlooking that valley. That includes certain sections of the front line under Russian control over here, but also, again, certain areas where the Ukrainians have control. And that goes for both the western and the eastern ridges. That could explain why the Russian forces would even want to probe on the eastern flank in the first place. First of all, the Russian forces are pretty close to some of the supply lines leading into Huliapoli, which is a major city on a local level. Again, it's like an area where a lot of these roads meet together, a lot of units, they get dispersed from this section into the actual line of contact. And so when looking at the roads, the front line is currently about 4 kilometers away from one of those key roads that is leading into Huliapoli. Of course, all around like 360 degrees, there are roads that are meeting over here. And so even capturing one wouldn't be the end of the logistical situation for Huliapoli. Again, the chances of a major operation occurring over here in the near future are extremely low. But more generally, there has been an increase in Russian pressure on the eastern flank of the city. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.